Hello, and on to Module 9, Law and Changemaking. And in this week we get into the key differences about the CQU programs that make them different from other law and criminology programs throughout Australia. And that's because we are part of the CQU project of being a changemaker campus and including 21st century skills in design thinking, in systems thinking, and different approaches to our traditional subjects. So criminologists will no doubt be already familiar with this from their criminology subjects. Lawyers will get exposed to it here, and it's a good space for both sets of students to discuss these principles. In a nutshell, what does it mean? There's been an emerging consciousness that the world's biggest problems are wicked problems. They're ones that can't just be solved by one person, one organisation, or one discipline. A health problem is not just a health problem. A legal problem is not just a legal problem, that these are all deeply interconnected. And this is something that will be familiar with to criminologists, for whom the idea of a cause of crime is never really one thing. It's always a series of interconnected events and factors and situations that put someone into a position where they make a decision to commit a crime. And but change making is bigger than those disciplines. It goes across the university. We're a member of a international group called Ashoka U, and this is a group that has been pioneering new ways of solving problems. So this module is to introduce you to those forms of problem solving and to integrate them into what we do as legal problem solvers. Fortunately, a lot of this is covered by the iChange module, which you'll be completing this week as the primary challenge for your workbook. So they explain this a lot better than I can. But from the point of view of law and justice, it's important to note that design has become an increasingly relevant and important part of the process. Previously, legal change has been fairly ad hoc, and no one's really thought about the bigger design concepts as to how legal change occurs, and largely it's because legal change has been the province of lawyers. It's been the province of people who do what they've always done before. And now we're looking at how do we bring those disciplines together and how do we plan the way in which we do legal change. So the first thing we talk about in this week's module is systems thinking. Systems thinking, design thinking, human-centered design, all these different ways of thinking do connect to each other. Systems thinking is just being able to think of things as interconnected systems. And to be able to try and map those out in a visualization to help you understand how systems work. Now, law has a really odd relationship to systems thinking. In some way, things like legislation are really early examples of systems thinking. If you think of a legislation as like a little machine or a piece of software code that defines terms and does things, as these subroutines that create exercises of power. They have if-then loops, if this happens, if that happens. In some ways, legislation is incredibly modern and is incredibly on page with what we're doing with systems thinking. But the overall parameters of how change occurs are still locked in this sort of old idea of, well, we'll just create a new set of laws and then we'll just kind of hope we've done the right thing and we'll unleash them on society and see if there's a problem. And that's tended to make legal change very, very conservative, because there's a great danger, and I mean conservative in the traditional sense, but there's a great danger of introducing a radically new change in the law if you've not tested it, if you've not prototyped it, if you've not found a way to check it how it works, that you could do a lot of damage. So that means that in the past, legal change has been very, very incremental and very, very slow. And the solution wasn't really necessarily just to do it faster, but to do it faster in a way that provided a safety net. And that's how, and we'll get to design thinking in a moment, design thinking provides a format in which you can think around problems and iterate solutions more quickly than the traditional models. And systems thinking give us new ways of understanding how systems work, and how crucially how different systems work differently and how they clash with each other. So if you're looking at something like a drug court, you'll find that you've got the legal system's way of doing things and the medical system's way of doing things, and they don't always agree on the outcomes. And systems thinking gives you a way of being able to map out those different systems and understand how they both use different processes and where they can be changed to work more effectively, and where there's a problem. So there's a little bit of a basic introduction to system thinking of flows and stocks and how to map them, some very simple maps of how you map those out through a system, and where stocks go in, where they get modified, where they go out, where there's feedback in a system. Not going to expect that in 1 week you're going to become an expert on this by any means, but I wanted you to get familiar with those diagrams and familiar with that idea of thinking about things in a more complicated way than just saying, we've got a problem, let's create a law that says you can't do that anymore, and let's hope that works. And systems thinking that you try and think about, well, what are the other consequences going to be? What are the ways in which you're going to push on a system in one way? It's going to create results and outcomes all over the place in ways that you don't necessarily foresee. So the next section looks at design thinking. And design thinking is really a process of structured creativity. It's a way of problem solving, and it gives you a cycle of creation. The important phases of which are things that seem, when you look at the system, you think, well, that's just common sense. That's very self-explanatory. But of course, starting with empathizing with the users of a system, the law never does that. The law never really looks at who's actually going to be affected by the law and understands their position. It starts with really about what you want to change, and then you hope it's going to be something that's not going to create too much resistance from the individuals who are going to be subject to the law. So design thinking provides an impetus to first of all start with the human beings in the system, a way of discovering and ideating and creating new ideas. And crucially, it works with the creation of prototypes and testing of prototypes in simulated hypothetical environments. So again, rather than saying, well, as of 1st of January next year, the new laws take effect and let's just cross our fingers and hope that it's not going to create problems for anyone, this new design thinking approach encourages us to set up scenarios and play through these hypothetical scenarios in a way that we can then see what happens. We can put people in that situation, we can get their feedback, we can get their understanding. The other thing to note about design thinking is that it's iterative, that when you finish one cycle you go back in again, and there's a bit of a it's an overworked cliche more than anything else now, but there's a bit of a saying amongst designers that you should always aim to fail and to fail quickly. But that makes sense when you're developing things in a safe, closed environment, in a simulated environment, that you're going to acknowledge that systems are going to fail, and what you want to do is get them to the point of failing quickly so you can understand how they fail, so when you do the next pass and develop the next iteration, you've improved. Again, something that traditionally you don't do with legal change, because you're working with a live audience, you're working with a live subject, and you really can't afford to have a system fail catastrophically in that context. So design thinking gives us a way of just thinking in a different approach to understanding legal change and systemic change. And this is something that's being picked up. I know Bond Law School has been running with it. It's becoming more and more popular in some of the law schools around the place, but it's not really mainstream thinking just yet. So we're trying to get you in on the ground floor in these new ways of thinking. Alright, so what else do we talk about this week? We talk a little bit about 21st century skills and a bit about dealing with clients and stakeholders. And that becomes very important when you consider that a lot of legal professionals are not going to necessarily work with individual private clients. A lot of law graduates are going to work in big organisational contexts, and there are some important skills about how we can, connect with people and understand their needs, and so some cautionary tales in there around the internet, which we once thought was going to solve all our problems, and create this fantastic communication environment where we would all get to understand each other in a much better way, and we would come to consensus much more quickly. And of course, social media has led to the exact opposite and has divided us into echo chambers of people just saying, the things that other people already agree with. So there's a little bit of an initial discovery there of what's going wrong with the internet, what's going wrong with social media, and how is that going to impact on you as a professional who is going to need to be able to communicate with clients, with other agencies, with other organisations, and within that digital world. So we're not solving all the problems of the world in in a couple of pages, but it's just important to start raising those issues and have you think about them. Alright, so the challenge is going to be a little different this week than usual. The core challenge, we're going to send you off to do the iChange module, which is an online module about change making, design thinking, etc. That is done by CQ University. And if you just want to do the core challenges, that's all you have to do for this week. So the workshop will look at the extended challenge, which is we're going to look at an application of these ideas in a legal context. So we're going to look at Indigenous remedies and some of the issues with regulating and providing intellectual property protection for those remedies, because those are created and shared traditionally in a very different context to the Western science paradigm of, scientist invents new drug, new chemical, patents it, and gets to live off the profits. The Indigenous knowledge context is very different, and in the past what we've seen is a lot of Indigenous remedies and plants around the world then get patented by big pharmaceutical companies because no one who's been using these things for hundreds or thousands of years knows the system well enough to patent it, and if they do, it's like, well, I don't really own it anyway, it's something my ancestors have used forever. And there's been a lot of very acrimonious conflicts internationally around how those things get recognised. Brazil has an interesting response to it because the Brazilian rainforest, while it's still there before it gets burnt down, is the source of so many of the new pharmaceuticals and new remedies in the world. But it'll be burnt down 2 weeks' time from now, and we won't have any of those anymore anyway. So that's a bit of a gloomy kind of aspect to this whole thing. So we also want to consider the Australian context and how we're going to go about protecting those Indigenous knowledges, not just for the sake of the Indigenous people and the Indigenous communities, but also for the rest of us, so that these are things that we have access to, and the next cancer cure, for all we know, could be in a herb or plant that's been used for other purposes for thousands of years. We don't know, and if we don't provide the right legal framework and incentives around that, we might miss out altogether. Alright, so we'll get onto that in the workshop this week. If you don't want to do if you just want to do the basic, you don't have to do, you just want to do the core challenge, you don't have to do this one, but you might as well come along to the workshop anyway. And I think this is a very interesting topic and a very interesting issue to explore, and it ties together a lot of the threads we've been throwing around so far, at least in the last few weeks, about law, legal change, responsibility, and so on. Alright, I'm recording this one early because I was so late last week, so I haven't had a chance to I haven't even sent out the check-in for this module, so I will deal with those further down the track. So please make sure you send in your responses to those, and I'll deal with those later, and I will see you in the workshops.